Welcome to the Future of Field Service podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. Today, I'm excited to welcome to the podcast Tim Baines of Aston Business School to discuss the advanced services transformation. We all know that organizations are somewhere on the journey to servitization and outcomes-based service, and we do a lot of coverage on those topics. Tim Baines is the professor of operations strategy and the executive director of the Advanced Services Group at Aston Business School. And they do a lot of work and research on these topics that I think our listeners today are going to find incredibly valuable. Tim, thank you so much for being with us today. I appreciate you joining the podcast.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right. So before we dig into some of the insights that you have with your research, can you tell our listeners a bit about yourself and the work that you do with the Advanced Services Group at Aston?
So my work is all about the servitization of manufacturing. It's all about helping companies who are coming from a traditional product base to compete through services, and particularly advanced services. And we use the term advanced services to really represent a cluster of high-value disruptive business models that manufacturers can adopt to help them compete inside the marketplace. The research centre my work in manufacturing goes back 25 years. I started my career working as a technician apprentice inside manufacturing industry, and then moved slowly but surely through business and then into academia. Our research center, all my work has been about manufacturing operations. Our research center was created specifically to really push forward the agenda of servitization, both in the UK and internationally. And we are very much, I like to think of us very much as like the centre of gravity for both the academic and the industrial community coming together to debate, understand servitization, and move forward with this innovation.
Mm-hmm. That's very cool. So you mentioned you've been in the manufacturing space for about 25 years. I've been in this role or a similar role covering this industry for about 13. So it's, I came into this evolution, about midway through your experiences, but it's been very interesting for me to see in interviewing service leaders and manufacturing business leaders day in and day out, how this has evolved and what these opportunities are. And, really how far we've come with a common understanding of why this trend is so important and how relevant it is to the future of these businesses. And then, of course, as we'll talk through today, really getting into the complexity of such change, and coming up with the plan for a successful journey. So I'm really interested to hear your perspectives today. So I've had a look at some of the research you've done on servitization in the Advanced Services Group. And as I mentioned to you before we kick this off, I think it's excellent. I think it's clear that it comes from a deep understanding of the industry. And it's really quite easy to understand, which I think makes it very helpful for companies in kind of charting their own path. So one of the pieces of content that I had a look at is what the Advanced Services Group has identified as 4 forces behind servitization, 2 of those internal and 2 external. So I'm hoping to start, you can kind of talk with us about those 4 forces and give us an overview of what they are.
Sarah, if I can, I'll just take you a bit of a step back, first of all, just to comment upon some of the introduction you gave to servitization. And if I may, almost like explain why it's such an important phenomena for manufacturing businesses and other service businesses to really understand. And the story goes like this, that as a university professor, as a senior professor in a top university in the UK, one of our roles is to be almost like an authority and a custodian of this knowledge upon a phenomena. And the phenomena that's interested me all the way through my career is this manufacturing operations. And what does good look like? And I think it's very interesting when you think about it from the perspective of an academic. Of course, we come across a lot of very senior business leaders that are engaged with business transformation, and they're in the trenches. They're bringing about this change. As a professor, quite often you have the luxury of taking a step back and reflecting upon the trajectory industry has followed uh, over hundreds of years, and it's a very popular term at the moment in time to think about. Very popular to think about the idea of a paradigm for manufacturing, and we have coming out of Germany, Industry 4 as a paradigm, and it might be shocking to some people to understand that not all professors subscribe to Industry 4 as a fourth paradigm for manufacturing, because it's a very technological view of the evolution of industry. And there's another view, which is almost like the social changes which have taken place inside industry, which is right behind what you're seeing with servitization. And the story goes something like this: that if you go back to to the very birthplace of what we recognize as regular manufacturing now. You go back, what the concept of a factory, what was the world's first factory that we would recognize? It was actually Bolton and Watts manufacturing, Birmingham, UK, manufacturing steam engines. And then you have Henry Ford coming along and creating something that we recognize as mass production. And that was the paradigm. And, in the 1980s and 1990s and the 2000s, we had this concept of lean. And everybody's now kind of thinking, well, what is the next thing? What are we going to do? And Industry 4 comes out. And Industry 4, in part, is a symptom, is kind of part of that change, but it's an incomplete part, because everything we have seen so far has been a combination of a reaction to both these market forces and what you're seeing in terms of technological change. And where you are today with servitization, it's really about a shift in our understanding of what it looks like to be a manufacturing business. Because the bottom line is that for many industries, the model of production and consumption, make, buy, make, sell, dump, that's gone. The rich carbon-based business models of the past in many industries are on a very limited timeline. What's happening is society is moving away from the consumption of products, moving towards the consumption of services. And you see that trend in all the international performance indicators. Developed economies like the UK, like the States, they're service-based economies. And servitization is all about manufacturing businesses responding to that shift in the societal appetite for services over society's appetite for products, and not just services which are about repairing a product or providing spare parts for a product, but services which provide outcomes. So when you think about the big picture that we're seeing, servitization to me is this shift towards this new emerging paradigm about what it means to be a manufacturing business. And most industries will get into that paradigm sooner or later. And when you think about the forces which are causing it to happen, it's the same forces which have shaped the paradigms for manufacturing over the past 200 years. They are the pull from society coupled with the technological innovations. And those, innovation takes place as the interplay between market pull and technology push. And that's what we're seeing. And manufacturing businesses and a lot of service businesses are all being caught up in this. Though they might not recognize it, that's what's actually happening. So when you think about service transformation inside a business, two of the big macro pressures which are determining what's going to happen are these two sets of forces on the outside. There are others, but they're the two which are first and foremost to keep in mind that change is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's just really the only thing you have control over is, to some extent, the rate at which it's going to happen. Does that start to set that context for you?
It's one of the best explanations of servitization that I've ever heard. I think it's perfect. It makes total sense to me, and I think it will make absolute sense to our listeners. And I think that to your point, or at least if I'm understanding one of the points you made, is as you're considering, as a business is considering how this journey applies to them specifically, it's important to make sure that their next steps are not dictated only by the technological forces, but also by those market forces.
Exactly.
So really understanding that social and societal aspect of what's at a very high level driving this need for change. And I do think that, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this today, but I do think that that is an area where people veer off course, because you have these advanced technologies, and they're really exciting, and they're great enablers. But if you start to go down a path of leveraging them and deploying them without a clear understanding of what those market forces are for your business, and ultimately what your customers want from you related to those outcomes and those experiences, then you're not looking at the big picture. So I think it's a great explanation, and that makes total sense to me.
And I see that what you've just described, I see that in businesses around the world, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not a conversation whether technology is more important than customers and markets. It's a conversation that both are important. It's the meshing
Mm-hmm.
together, and and so when we look at this change process, when you look at change that's taking place inside a manufacturing business, and I'm referring to manufacturing businesses, but it's not exclusively manufacturing businesses by
Mm-hmm.
any means. But let's just focus on those for the moment. You've got a situation where change is going to happen either as a reaction, where you are forced into make a change because of the circumstances,
Mm-hmm.
or it's going to happen because you are looking forward and you are trying to shape the future for your business. And when we look at servitization, when we look at those businesses which have really be at the forefront of the adoption of the more advanced services. And I'm thinking about some of the cases, people like Rolls-Royce, for example, is probably the best exemplar I can think of in terms of their development of what people recognize as power by the hour, but it's actually something called total care inside the business. When you look at somebody like Rolls-Royce, I very much see it that, I understand it that Rolls-Royce were pulled into this space. And they've been pulled, and a lot of businesses are looking at people like Rolls-Royce and they're saying, "How did they do it?" Well, they got pulled into this space, but that doesn't explain how businesses should do it, because it's about how you shape the future can be informed by what
Mm-hmm.
people like Rolls-Royce have done, but it's not about following their path, and it's about looking forward, understanding how technology and how markets can be combined and how you can exploit those through these more advanced services. And the advanced services, we recognize them in various ways. Some people will talk about them as being outcome-based contracts or performance-based contracts. I purposely use the term advanced services because I don't want people just to think about it as a contract. It's much
Mm-hmm.
bigger than that. It's a collection
Yeah.
of different forms of business models which are high
Mm-hmm.
value and disruptive, and really speak to the shift towards an outcome-based society. That's what we're
Yeah.
talking about, responding to an outcome-based society.
Yes. I had a call recently with someone who was a service leader within an organization, and he was asking me some questions around, well, we've deployed IoT and no one wants to buy it. None of our customers want to buy it.
Yeah.
And I said, well, how are you marketing it to them? I mean, are you telling them that you've deployed IoT so you want them to buy it? Because one, they probably don't understand what that means. And two, it doesn't matter to them. That's a tool your company has within its arsenal to provide an outcome to your customer, but that is not the outcome, right? So we could get into a whole discussion, I'm sure, about different examples and
Yeah,
and whatnot.
we have a separate conversation that we ought to have, which is really about the form of those business models and about how you describe those
Yes.
business models and how you make sure that the language you use to describe those business models isn't simply a replay of what it is that you do inside your organization to deliver the outcome, or it isn't overly suggestive that says that it's always going to be a panacea, because that's not true either. So we'll park it for the moment. Maybe we should come back and speak about the business model specifically. I know you're interested today in transformation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I'm going to make a note of that, and I'd love to have you back. And the other point that we should probably not dig into in an effort to stay on track with what we've defined today is, I would be. You talked about these companies really are either going to be forced into this change, or they're going to see this opportunity and be proactive about making this change, right? And one of the conversations we've had a lot of this year is how COVID-19 has played a role in that first idea of some of these companies that were lagging, in either accepting that this change is a reality, or they had accepted it, but they were lagging on taking action on actually, embarking on this journey, have sort of been propelled forward. And I'm really interested to see over the next few years how that plays out in sort of a spur of progress through, this journey. So I would love to talk with you about that too.
Yeah,
but
we should have that conversation.
We would be here for a few hours at least. So I will write those two topics down, and we'll have you back soon. Okay, so we talked about the need to consider both the market forces and the technological forces that are leading to this. Tell us about the other two forces that play a role here.
So if I think the way to think about this is when we work with a manufacturing business to try and understand, it's very try and understand what's happening. First of all, you have to be quite clear. There's some people will talk about it as a shift from products to services. Now, we don't use that language. And the reason that we don't use it is that we don't want to suggest to a company that it has to abandon products and production. There's a danger in that. It can cause people who are today in the production operations of a company, it can cause them anxiety. So we don't need to worry about that. So we don't talk about shift, we don't talk about transition, we talk about transformation. And we'll talk about servitization in simple terms. For a manufacturing company, building revenue from services as rather than just products alone. And we're interested in a particular type of services, and these are these advanced services. So we're about a business which makes product, looking to expand itself, not just to deliver services which support the product's condition, but to deliver services which ultimately deliver the outcome that the product enables. So we're about providing, the shift from selling gas boilers to houses to selling heat as a service, a shift from selling air conditioning units to selling cooling as a service, from selling automobiles and cars to selling mobility as a service. That's the shift that we're talking about. Now, when you start to when we look back, and we've done quite a lot of work where we've looked at manufacturing businesses, and and included in our mix of manufacturing businesses we've studied are companies that you will know, and people like Rolls-Royce, Caterpillar, Goodyear, Alstom. They've all been in that mix. We've done case studies on all these companies, and we've looked back at the journey they've been through, and we tried to rationalize it. Because one of the, when you think about the contribution that the research community makes to this conversation, is it's all about providing the frameworks which help people to understand what's going on. We're providing for them the skeleton, which they can then dress in a way which reflects their organization, but we're providing the bare bones of this is what the change looks like. So looking back, when we try and make sense of what we see an organizational transformation, because that's what it is. It isn't just about selling a few services. It's about an organizational transformation, because it's the organization which delivers the services. They don't just appear. So it's about an organizational transformation from production to also providing services, especially with these more advanced services, an organizational transformation. And the success and the rate of that transformation is being determined by forces which you can group into four categories. Two, we've already spoke about the market pull, the appetite, the customer's appetite for these services and the technology push. If you go to a group of customers and they really want these services, they'll pull you into this space. If you've got lots and lots of technology and it's everywhere, you're going to spot the opportunities. So the interplay between the market pull and technology push are very, very powerful. But then you've got these other two forces, or the two sets of forces. One set of forces is all about where you are in the value network. So if you as an organization are dealing directly with the customer that would be interested in acquiring these more advanced services from you, you're going to find it easier to gain traction and likely to be more successful than an organization that is much, much further down the value chain. So an organization which is perhaps developing an engine, which then goes onto a gearbox, which goes into a generator, which is sold through a distributor, specified by an architect, ends up inside a building which is rented by somebody, that becomes a more complicated situation. So where you are in the value network affects you. So does your internal organizational almost like culture, the conditions inside your organization. If you've got a management which is committed to this, you'll move faster. If you've got a management which is skeptical, you'll move slower. Even during, it's very interesting, even during COVID-19, people react to change in different ways. And we have seen one of the businesses we're working with in this space, up until recently was starting to incubate some of these things, these more advanced services. COVID-19 hits, and this particular business has kind of abandoned its plans to move into services, move back to pushing boxes. And when you say why, well, the managing director of this business, he's looking forward to his pension. He's only got another 18 months in the position. He wants to make sure that so he is making sure that his business fulfills those needs that he has to make sure that his pension pot is. So that's an indication of that internal culture inside the organization.
Right.
So even people, like you and I are going out there and absolutely advocates for this and believe in it, and he might even believe it in himself. But when he's thinking about his own pension pot, it's a different story. So you've got these two sets of forces, which are more about the positioning of the organization, both externally and internally, which are affecting it. And really, we think that all the rate in which an organization progresses can really be determined by those four sets of forces. Does that fit with what you've seen before?
Yes, I think so. And I think that really those organizational forces are what either propel a company through or really get them kind of stuck in the muck.
Yes.
And so it's very interesting. Okay, so we talked about the four forces. Now those four forces are leading companies through phases of this journey to servitization. So there's four phases that you've identified. So can you tell us what those four phases are? Yeah.
Okay. So it's interesting. You can approach the conversation about this transformation from different angles. You can start. Quite often, I would actually start to talk about, first and foremost, those almost like stages of organizational maturity, and then think about the forces. We've spoke about the forces first, and now we'll talk about the stages of organizational maturity. It doesn't matter. It's just really, for people listening to us today, I guess it's just to flag at this stage that you can think about the transformation from two different perspectives. And this stages of organizational maturity is the second phase, the second way of thinking about it. So people will come and they will say, okay, I'm interested in servitization, but I don't know what it is. I don't know what type of services I might offer. Do I need a new, will I need to get the buy-in of my senior executive? And which customers should I pilot with? How am I going to get paid for it? What investment? What we're going to do with technology partners? Am I going to have a new organization? What we're going to do with existing products? They're overwhelmed. Very often when we start a conversation with people about servitization, they're absolutely overwhelmed. And they'll say to you, should they'll say all those things to you, and they'll typically say something like, "Should we have a separate organisation for services?" And we'll say, "You might, but you don't need to worry about it yet. You can push
Mm-hmm.
that forward." And that's what this transformation journey is all about. It's about saying, look, there's lots of decisions that you are going to need to make, lots of decisions leading to actions, but you need not worry about all those things up front. When you look retrospectively at the businesses which have been successful and had success in this area and map it out, you will see they'll go through 4 phases.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start to think about the decisions and actions relative to those 4 phases, the whole thing becomes simpler. And the 4 phases that typically they will go through are the first phase of exploration, where they're thinking about whether servitization is relevant to them. They'll be asking questions such as, "Are we going to make any money out of it? You know, do we need senior management support, etc." That's this exploration phase. If a company is successful at exploration, it'll mean that they've built up a kind of a conviction inside the company that there's something in servitization for them. And when those companies have achieved that state, they'll move into what we call engagement. Now, engagement is where companies start to experiment with different business models based around services. And the whole conversation about what is a
Mm-hmm.
business model and what's a revenue model and what's a service delivery system is a separate conversation to have, which we haven't got time to go in here. But it's about the engagement phase is about unpicking what that business model looks like, going to customers, understanding
Mm-hmm.
pains and gains, bringing it all together, testing it, piloting it, reviewing it. And it's all about the organization demonstrating to itself that there's value in this stuff. Once the organization has really got that stage, we've got evidence, we believe it, we can see it, we're evidence that there is opportunity here. Then the organization moves into scaling. And scaling, as you can imagine, is all about rolling out new customer value propositions, new business models in different regions. And once it gets through scaling, it then will move into a phase of exploitation. And exploitation is where it's looking for efficiencies in its delivery. So if you take an organization like Rolls-Royce Aerospace, um, you, quite a lot of what you see at Rolls-Royce will be in the exploitation phase. Lots of the
Mm-hmm.
initiatives will be about efficiencies, will be about ensuring effectiveness of their more higher value services. Whereas if you take companies that we have worked with in the past, companies that you might not be so familiar with, but we've worked with people like um, Ishida and stuff like that, and Mazak. They're much more in this exploration phase where they're
Mm-hmm.
trying to see whether there's an opportunity for them in this space. But the value of thinking about it in terms of these 4 phases, Sarah, of exploration, engagement, expansion, and exploitation, the value of thinking about it like that is you can look at it and you can say, there's conversations which are typical of this phase, and that's where I am, so I only need to focus on this, and I'll get these things right before I then move to that phase, and then to move to that phase, and then to move to that phase. And your progression through these phases of maturity will be affected by these 4 sets of forces coming in at it. So a final thing to say is it's important not to be overly prescriptive. I wouldn't go to a company and say the first thing you must do is A, then B, then C, because of course company situations change. So you've a framework like this is helpful to give a structure to what's going on, but it doesn't prescribe. It doesn't say you must do this, then you must do that, then you must do the other, because of course
Right.
entry points differ, companies differ. So I've just said a lot there, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything particular that you'd like me to dig into or clarify?
So I think it makes sense. And I think what you mentioned at the beginning, that sense of overwhelm that companies often come to you with, this sort of framework helps minimize or reduce that overwhelm, right? If you can say, here's where you are, so let's just focus on this box first, right? And these specific steps that commonly happen in this phase, and before you worry about this end of the journey. So I think that makes sense, and I think that one of the points that I always bring up to folks is you know, I think this journey applies to businesses of many sizes. Obviously there's different scales, but those societal and social themes that you talked about really are trickling down, from the largest companies all the way through.
Yeah.
And so when you think about that, that means that at some point a company like Rolls-Royce has developed a team specific to, this servitization stuff. But in some of the mid-size and smaller companies, oftentimes it's someone that's leading this charge, at least initially, in addition to doing their quote unquote day job, right? And so that overwhelm can be crippling to making progress because it just seems insurmountable. So I think something like these phases that talks about, like you said, it's not prescriptive, but it's based off of interacting with a lot of different companies and observing those commonalities. It gives people some areas of focus, to kind of ease some of that overwhelm. So I think that makes good sense. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add, it was interesting because if you look at that roadmap, that framework, and it's published in academic journals and it's on our website, etc. That came from this research which observed these case studies of businesses, and I use companies like Caterpillar and Goodyear and Rolls-Royce because you'll be familiar with them. But we also study small businesses, just like you've said, and we work a lot with small businesses. Small businesses because it can be incredibly agile and it's very, very good. So one of the businesses we work with is a company called Cool Mill, and that does high-speed rice milling machines. It's a British company. It's looking to sell its product in China. And it's not looking to sell its products in China. It's trying to break into the Chinese market. And to do so, it's saying, right, we're not going to try and sell a rice milling machine. We're going to sell rice milling as a service. A small company, relatively speaking, but it fits exactly with what we've seen. And that's kind of one of the tests of frameworks like this, is that they have to be relevant to businesses large and small. And they help you just get this clarity about what it is that you're trying to do. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's interesting when you look back at some of the management literature, some of the frameworks that people use in everyday business operations, frameworks like pest analysis, SWOT analysis. They're just valuable, straightforward, simple frameworks. And they've been around for many years. And it's that type of framework which I think is most helpful to businesses, not something which is too convoluted, too complex to understand.
Absolutely. So I was curious to ask, Tim, where, right now, based on the interactions you have and what you've witnessed in the market, in those 4 phases, where do you see the majority of organizations today?
Exploration and engagement. Absolutely. We have 2 consortiums of businesses that work with the research centre. One is a consortium based around large businesses, and the second is a consortium based around small businesses. The large business consortium tends to have a fewer number of businesses, but we tend to have a more deeper intervention with those. And we do this. It's called the Advanced Services Partnership, and we work with these businesses because it helps. We help them and they help us to understand the process of servitization. And when you look at these businesses, they're all businesses which they're great companies to work with because they're genuinely committed to this and they're pushing ahead with it. And when you look at them, invariably they're in the exploration and engagement phase. And when you look at where they sit compared to their peers in the marketplace, invariably they're ahead of the game. So I think, we first started to work on servitization. My first paper on servitization was the late 1990s. And when we started to do some of our very early research and publications in the late 90s, early 2000s, we were using this term servitization, and the common question people would say to me is, how do you spell it? And, do you spell it with a Z or an S? And everybody in the UK was trying to change it to an S. And I would stand up and say, no, it's a Z, because it's American for us. It's an American word. I also then went into history and said, actually, the American language is a true representation of the old English than the current, but that's a different story. So the use of Zs was actually an English language previous. Anyway, long story. But using it with a Z, and we have a whole conversation about servitization. Why do you spell this word? What does it mean? And then you say to people, it's about competing through services, and they say, oh, we do this already. We sell spare parts. And then you get into a conversation. Now, today, people don't come to me and say, what's this thing called servitization? How do you spell it? We've moved beyond that. So we are in the we're kind of getting slowly but surely through exploration. But the conversations they're having is, what's the business model look like? And then I'm saying, be careful in your mind. There's a difference between business model and revenue model and service, et cetera, et cetera. So we start to unpack that, and then they'll talk about pains and gains, and then so they're entering that, and they're interested in business models. But of course, we're talking about a subset of business models. So they'll go and get, for example, the business model canvas, which is a great tool, but it's a very generic tool. It's like using SWOT analysis to form strategy. Great tool, but it's too generic. So we're talking about a subset. And so there are tools out there which help specifically with that subset. And that's kind of where companies are. They're kind of poking at it. Today, of course, lots of businesses immediately are concerned about COVID and such like that. And they want to innovate the way out of it. And you're saying to them, yes, let's innovate. Let's innovate the business model, and let's innovate the business model towards services. And that's a way to break out of it. Most businesses, I would say, Sarah, exploration, early stages of engagement.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and that's very much in line with what I would see from talking with a lot of these companies as well. The one observation I had when I was looking through the framework is, while it's a much smaller sample of businesses that have reached the exploitation phase, the one thought I had that I was curious to get your thoughts on is, those companies that are leading this charge, that have worked their way through those 4 phases, and they've successfully reached the exploitation phase. So you mentioned, some of them by name. It seems to me that this would, not end, right? Like, it's not, we reached exploitation, we've crossed the finish line, let's put our feet up and have a cocktail. It would naturally revert back to exploration, because in my mind, once companies have understood the criticality of this journey and they've experienced walking through it and going through those phases and understanding those forces and developing value propositions and successfully turning those into service models and whatnot, they would naturally continue to look for those next opportunities. Do you think that's an accurate observation?
Yes, it is. You're exactly right. That's exactly what happens, of course. And if you take a step back and you see these phases of exploration, these 4 phases, and of course, those 4 phases are true of whether you're developing a service, an advanced service, or even just worrying about products. And this is the secret, is that the reason that they stack up is that one of the things that we did as a group of researchers, one of the things it's important to do is to go back to theory. And theory has a bad press amongst industrialists. Very often they'll say, don't give me theory, tell me what it's like in practice. And I think really what they're saying is, look, don't be too abstract. Make sure that what you tell me is relevant to what I'm doing. But theory is helpful, because theory tells us how different variables relate to each other. Theory tells us in a very abstract way how things change. And the theory that underpins the model that we've talked about today is the theory of business growth. And business growth goes through phases, and often people will talk about it perhaps going through 5 phases of incubation, expand, launch, incubation, expand, all those type of things. And we've rationalized it at 4, whether it's 4, 7, 6, 5, it doesn't matter. It's the fact that it's a business growth. And the way business growth happens is that You start off, you go through a period of relatively smooth change as you're starting to get to grips with what it is you're really doing, and then you go through a period of very rapid, very disruptive change, and then it settles, and then you move on, and then you rapid change, and then settles and move on. The process is called, and this is a great phrase. The phrase, the process is called punctuated equilibrium. Equilibrium punctuated by these periods, and you go through and move on, and that's the basic theory. It's equivalent to Einstein's theory of relativity, but it's a social science theory. That's a basic theory which underpins this change, and that's what you're actually seeing. You're seeing this theoretical, the theory explain it. So when you say to me, Tim, this model is this model true of all? When we think about a business, it's moved, it's developed, it's exploiting these things, yes, and then it'll move and it'll think about the next one, yes, and it moves up what's called the services staircase. Separate conversation that fits with our business model conversation. It moves up that staircase. However, it does make an assumption there, and the assumption is that the business doesn't forget, and businesses do forget, and you can. If you go to some businesses, who are actually advanced in this space, and you say, "How did you get here?" They've forgotten. They've got some excellent exemplars of more advanced services, but they're in isolation. It was created because we had a particular customer who pulled us in that space. We formed a group of people. We pulled it all together. We made it a success. We've been running it for 10 years, and all those people there have now retired. So, businesses do forget. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. But you are right. It's this continual. Servitization is an innovation. It's an innovation. Innovation of we give this name servitization to describe the innovation of an organization. And we're really, it comes right the way back to where we started our conversation today. We're really at the root of what we're talking about is kind of coming up with a picture of what an organization, in our world, a manufacturing organization, looks like to compete in the world of the 21st century. We know what an organization looked like that manufactured Model T Fords. We know what the organization looked like which manufactured steam engines. What does the organization look like that manufactures services? That's the question that you're dealing with all this.
Yeah. Well, Tim, I could ask you many, many more questions today, but I know we're almost out of time, and so I would love to have you back soon. I think there's at least the two conversations we dug into, we mentioned earlier to dig into, and I also think it would be interesting to have a conversation around, what are the common missteps? Where do companies kind of veer off course? But let's have you back and dig into those if you would be so kind. And I also wanted you to tell our listeners, the Advanced Services Group is having a World Servitization Conference in September, which I'll be a part of, and I'm so excited for. So can you tell folks a bit about that and where they can sign up and find some information?
Yeah, well, first of all, Sarah, thank you for the conversation today. I too have enjoyed it. So great questions. Thank you. Right. So part of our activity at Aston is very much about cultivating the international community around servitization, the academic community and practitioner community. And for the past 10 years, we have run something called the Spring Servitization Conference, which is a prestigious academic conference, research conference in this space. And that's moved around Europe, and it's done extremely well. This year, we're actually the academic community has a great platform for having a conversation about servitization, but the industrial community doesn't. The industrial community doesn't have the same platform, which is, how can I put it, is a neutral platform where people can come along and see what manufacturers who are leading this space are doing, learn from them, and not feel pressurized necessarily to buy something or to take on some consulting or whatever. So we wanted to create this platform for the industrialists to have an equivalent conversation to the academics. So we've created the World Servitization Convention. It's on the basis of what we've done before. This year, of course, it's virtual, but it's been done with a lot of care. We've gone out and acquired a platform which gives us an experience which is as close to the experience that you would have as if going to a physical event. So we've got a whole platform of keynote speakers, and we've got 25 businesses exhibiting what it is that they're doing in this space, and their leaders, their executives will be there, and they'll be talking about their shift, their business models. There will be times to have a conversation with them, and it's going to be as close to having that physical exhibition as we can get using virtual digital technologies. So it's in September. We'll post you the link, Sarah, after this, and if people would like to come along to that, it's targeted at manufacturing community. And IFS is sponsoring this, and we're delighted that they're supporting it. So if anybody listening to this podcast would like to come along, send you the link, register for it, just come and listen to people that are actually doing that. The purpose is all about forming the industrial community to advance servitization.
I'm looking forward to it. I really am. We'll make sure we post the link in the show notes, which will be on the podcast episode page. So we'll make sure we do that. Tim, it was a pleasure having you today. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to having you back very soon. So thank you again.
Thank you, Sarah. Bye-bye.
You can find more content on servitization and other topics by visiting us at www.futureoffieldservice.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn as well as Twitter at The Future of FS. The Future of Field Service podcast is published in partnership with IFS. You can learn more about IFS service management by visiting www.ifs.com. As always, thank you for listening.